Paul, thanks very much for joining us today. So, Stripe as a DNS, are you crazy?
You're not the first to make that allegation. Yeah. It's so it's an interesting idea. So I love the idea when you're working with APIs and systems of trying to figure out where the limits are by pushing and pulling them into slightly unusual positions and seeing what breaks, what works, what doesn't. And Stripe as a DNS it's a good way of experimenting with something, but then learning enough about it to be able to work on it in a practical, real-world manner afterwards. So
how exactly did you make that work? Because I don't think it's a natural use case that I've really heard from anybody else, but you have some fairly fascinating reasoning and an approach to this.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably not a case you've heard from many other people for very good reason. So I've seen some blog posts in the past from, say, Corey Quinn, who advises people on cutting down their AWS bills and managing their AWS systems. He had a theory that you could use Route 53, Amazon's DNS system, as effectively a database. You know, a database, you put data in, you ask for it, you get it back. DNS, put a record in, you ask for it, you get it back. So if you kind of squint your eye, tilt your head a little bit to the side, it's conceptually similar. But he wrote a kind of tongue-in-cheek blog post, but explaining how you could do this and it would work in a practical sense. And that kind of set off my synapses firing, going, I love this idea of just looking at something in a slightly different way and making it work. And I saw a similar tweet a few months ago from Peter Levels, who's a sort of an indie hacker, where he had done something very similar with DNS, where he had hooked an LLM behind it. So you could send what's ostensibly a DNS request and you get back some sort of LLM answer for whatever your question was. And I looked at these and I thought, okay, so you have DNS, which is a very stable, systematic, simple system. You're using that to power something in an unusual or off-book sort of way. I thought, well, maybe you could do something the other way around. So how could we power DNS using something that is itself a little bit off-book or not really intended for that use case? And obviously, Stripe was the first thing that I thought of at that point. So I thought that you could use something like Stripe's metadata structure for this. So I find metadata it's like the magic glue that holds systems together, and it's flexible, but it's robust, it's well documented, and it's very clear. So I started a project to see, okay, could I have DNS but power it using Stripe metadata? And the answer is kind of yes. Yeah.
But it's actually a really interesting approach, because I know it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it does force you to think about how can things be repurposed in different ways. And often people just say, well, I should build a new service from scratch, but that isn't always the case, especially when you have time limitations as well.
Absolutely. I think when you're under the clock, it's always tempting to say, okay, in an ideal world, what's our greenfield solution here? Let's go build this new system, build this new service, and so on. But we're all working under time pressure for one reason or another. And I think when you've done these kind of experiments, you can start to look at systems and say, okay, well, technically the system does this, but can I stretch it 10% in this direction? And now that will solve more of my original problem, where I now don't need to spin up a fleet of Lambdas or new infrastructure to manage this. And poking around at systems like this in a joking way gives you an idea of where those boundaries may or may not exist, and what you can kind of stretch and pull the systems into unusual ways to really help your own day-to-day real world needs, rather than your work rather than your play. That's it.
Now, a lot of our customers and people watching this video think of Google Sheets as really just a spreadsheet, but you have a different approach.
I do, yes. So Google Sheets, it turns out, can be used as your production database and API layer, as I learned recently, for better or worse. So within Google Sheets, you have a sort of scripting layer. So you can publish your sheet, and you can give it a scripting layer that says, I'm going to return JSON taking cell A1, B2, whatever, and format it out. And we used this very successfully recently with a very large news publisher who had the election coming up in Ireland. And the elections are great for getting the creative juices flowing of everyone in the newsroom. We're going to do this new feature and this kind of new game, and we're going to build a game to build your dream government coalition, that sort of stuff. But the existing CMS doesn't really support it. The existing CMS is brilliant for publishing news articles, not so much for this kind of temporary thing you're going to do that'll have a lot of attention for 3 weeks and then will vanish for an election cycle again. So usually there's the conversations around, are we going to build something from scratch? What can we do? We have 3 weeks notice before the election, so that's not really going to be a runner. But we need a system where you're going to have some form of access control. You're going to have the ability to roll back any changes that someone has made, and it needs to be robust and scalable and all of these things. And Google Sheets ticks all of these boxes for one reason or another with people who are already using the authentication within Google. So what we were able to do was get this sheet, have the editors use it. They already know how to use Sheets. There's no additional training stuff going on here. And they were able to publish the data. We could use a Cloudflare worker sitting in front of it. We helped it scale up, and handle it flawlessly on the night of the election, and then 2 or 3 weeks later it can go back into the press and not be spoken of again until the next cycle. But in a serious way, it solves a real world problem, high traffic, high impact, high visible thing, but we managed to do it by taking, again, Google Sheets and just twisting it a little bit to the left, and suddenly we were able to deploy something that solved the problems and didn't spike our AWS bills or leave some infrastructure trail somewhere that we then need to worry about after that.
I think it's fascinating because it's not just all about writing code. There are always other constraints in putting solutions together around the amount of time you have, whether things can scale and so forth. So even though it seems, on the surface of it, wild, actually it's really smart. And why not? Is there anything particularly wrong with using these sorts of services this way?
I think, is there anything wrong with using them? I think it'll depend on the hard limits that you may or may not run into.
Right.
I think that's the issue. Like in the case of, let's say, this election thing, for example, Google Sheets is great in the short term. If we're looking at something that we're going to reuse every month for the next 4 years, then maybe we're saying, okay, let's take a slightly different approach, because now we do technically have our main data entry system over here, and we do have a different system people are using for this feature, which it's fine in the short term, but longer term, less so. But I think once you're aware of the constraints and you're aware of how long your solution is going to be in use, what your roadmap is, is this a throwaway piece? Is it the MVP? And then we're going to come back and do something more robust afterwards. I think these type of approaches can really get you there a lot more quickly with a lot less engineering effort to then free up more time for your roadmap planning or your V2 or whatever that may be down the line.
Yeah. So as a CTO in your line of work, how much when you're designing things do you think about designing for the purpose that something has now versus how it might need to be used in the future? Hopefully, not too much for the left tilt, but just how you might need to readapt it.
There's always a balance there, because I think there's a risk that when you're sitting down to design a system, there's the problem that needs to be solved today, and there's the problem that might need to be solved in 5 years. If like the Collisons sit down to design Stripe on day one, if they're designing for what it looks like today, they'll never get the thing out the door, because you're putting in so many abstractions, so many if else maybe let's handle for this, where there's a practical need to let's get this business in front of the real world so people can tell us are our assumptions correct. We're looking at this down the line, but maybe the market is going to tell us you should be over here somewhere. So there's always that kind of trade-off between what's going to work today and are we setting ourselves up from an engineering perspective so that the V2 is achievable or not. So yeah, you need to have, I think, awareness of that, but not necessarily be tightly bound to it so that you're kind of locking yourself in and making your MVP slower and slower to market, really. Because I think speed to market is really it's the big thing. You need to be out there, and for all the research you've done, for all your own market, the market itself will come along, and what's Napoleon say? No plan survives contact with the enemy. As soon as you hit the market, something's going to change, and you need to adjust tax. You need to have that flexibility, but having the North Star of we think we're going in this direction, I think is useful when you're making those architectural decisions internally and deciding, are we going to stand up a MySQL database, or have we a fleet of Google Sheets sitting in the background here that we're playing with?
Yeah, you gave a fantastic presentation at the meetup, which we'll link to in the description. But you made an interesting point about Victorian railway arches and how they're empty in Victorian areas, and obviously they couldn't imagine what they'd be used for today. Yeah,
I think so. So the idea here is that if you go to London, for example, you see all of these beautiful old railway bridges. They have the arches, and they've done their job, which is to get the trains running straight from one place to the other. And when they were built in a robust and a stable way, but no one designing them was thinking we're going to have coffee shops and gyms and internet cafes taking up residence in the arches underneath. But because the system was so well built, it was so robust, it's able to adapt to those other kind of uses that people are, maybe not seeing at design time, but they build something strong, they build something robust, and the market, the world can come along and say, oh, well, actually, I have an idea. Let's do this, and let's run DNS out of the arch of a railway bridge or something. I don't know. But the key thing there is the robustness of the design and the simplicity of the design lent itself to extension that the original creators never would have needed or never would have thought of at the time.
Well, one final question. So are you thinking of any other services you can abuse in the next few weeks? Or?
That's a very good question. Yeah. Playing around with a few different Cloudflare workers. I think Cloudflare workers have a lot of potential for solving sort of a small plumbing between systems. So in our work, a lot of the time, we will be split between here's a greenfield system, or let's build a new system together. But then sometimes you're working with companies who say, we have these 5 big systems that are set in stone and no one can change them, no one can move them, but somehow we need to get data from this thing to this thing here. And the glue between them is often where some of the, say, the more interesting engineering challenges can arrive. And we find things like Cloudflare Workers can plug those gaps in nice, neat ways, or possibly Stripe metadata as a bridge, maybe. We'll see. But so there's a lot in that space where we're finding companies who have sort of set tech stacks, and they're trying to operate in the gaps. The teams, they're trying to do their job in the gaps between legacy systems procured 10, 15 years ago that aren't going away anytime soon, but they're not changing anytime soon, and they need to change and adapt with the market and the new things coming out. So that's where we're spending a lot of time at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it really does shine a light on a very interesting way to think about things. That certainly, you know, as you become more senior and you have to think about architecture, there's a lot to learn in that space. And I really enjoyed your presentation that you gave, so I recommend everybody take a look at that. Again, the link is in the description. But thanks very much, Paul, for joining us today.
Great stuff. Thanks for having me. It was great. Cheers.